On this channel, I like to demonstrate games where black wins with my beloved Sicilian Kalashnikov. But this time, I'm succumbing to a vocal minority that would like to see a loss with the opening. So I'd like to thank Andreas Hauer, who's a loyal viewer of the channel, who sent this game to me. It was played at the beginning of August in Austria. So I'm not showing this game to satisfy all the doomsters and gloomsters who want to see the Kalashnikov misfire. But I'm going to look at it and analyse it because actually I think it's a very instructive game. We can all learn from this, no matter if you're a Kalashnikov player or the opening doesn't interest you at all. I think it's very instructive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to play through the whole game so you can get the big picture. And then I'm going to go back and highlight a few critical moments where it went wrong for black, where I think black could improve. Perhaps you'd like to think critically and do the same as I'm playing through the game. And of course, if you'd like to learn more about the Sicilian Kalashnikov, there is my book available from New in Chess. I'll put the link down below. And of course, you can get the course as on Chessable as well, with all the move repetition and stuff like that. Right, here we go. Alexander Gschwandtl against Andreas Hauer. And this game was played in Schwarzach in Austria at the beginning of August. It's an open Sicilian and e5. So here we go. It's main line of the Kalashnikov variation. And here there are two main moves, knight c3 or c4. And here c4 was played. So there's this Marozzi bind that puts a big clamp on black's centre. Bishop e6, that's absolutely fine, normal development. Now once white's knight hits c3, then it's time to push the other knight back to a3. So it takes white time to rearrange the minor pieces. Knight is a bit out of play on a3. g6, so this is the method of development that I favour in the book and in the course. I think it gives black dynamic chances, putting the bishop on g7. And here again, I favour putting the knight on f6. Bishop e2. Castles. So if white castles here, this is, you could say, one of the, almost like the starting position of the main line. And I've demonstrated that in quite a few games, actually. But here is where white plays something a little bit different. And according to my database, this is a new move. h4. Well, advancing the h-pawn has generally become more popular over the past few years. I think AlphaZero has given players the license to play in such an aggressive way. But I'd like to make 2 points about that. One, many of us were playing in this way long before AlphaZero was a glint in Demis Hassabis's eye. And two, just because it can be played doesn't mean it should be played. Okay, I'll come back to this move later on. And here h6 was played. So black reacts to the advance of the h-pawn. I will certainly come back to that position. Queen d2, so white gains a tempo on the pawn here. King h7. Rook d1, so the pressure is increasing. And here black goes backwards. Knight e8. I'll also return to that position. h5. g5. So white is not breaking through to the king. However, there are serious weaknesses around black's king. So notably the f5 square. g4. So that ensures that black can't break with f5 which means that this bishop is not great. Rook c8, yeah, that's the standard development of the rook on the semi-open file. f3, so white is just securing the position, making sure that everything is very nicely protected. Knight b8, that's another piece going backwards. Knight d5, I think already this is a very difficult position for black because white is so secure. You know, where is black's counterplay? This is the big problem. And after bishop takes knight, c takes, I think that's the best recapture. If you recapture the other way, then black always has the option to break with e4 to let that bishop loose. So this is very good. And basically the structure we have now, well, we see this in King's Indian positions where it's gone very badly wrong for black. So still no chance of getting any counterplay with f5. White has two bishops, and both those bishops are superb. And essentially white is going to break through on the queen side eventually. Queen c7 allows this beautiful move with a discovered attack on the queen. Frankly, if I were black, I might be tempted just to give up the queen and play this. And, well, you have a rook and minor piece against the queen. Of course, white is winning, but maybe that's not so easy. At least black is active. Whereas in this position, once the knight reaches f5, that is a catastrophe total. So, exchange of rooks. Rook e8, I mean, the knight is just wonderful, hitting these pieces. And essentially nothing has changed. An excellent move from white, taking control of the open file. White is strategically winning, although there were a few little ups and downs along the way. So b4, absolutely correct. And here I think the simplest move for white is just to play a4 and a5 and go for a breakthrough. But there's a bit of messing around here. I mean, white is still totally in control. And here, I think just exchanging and again pushing forward at a4, winning advantage. Now it's not quite as clear as before. You can see this bishop is actually starting to crawl towards the queen side. Knight f5, mistake. That should be exchanged off. And after this, I think black's position is tenable. Should be fine. But instead of that, this was played. And again, another chance. Black could have played knight d4 here. And if this is swapped off, I mean, even if that pawn is lost, then this bishop will find some freedom and possibly the queen as well. And actually, white has to be a little bit careful there. But instead, knight g7 played, again, too passive, and the game resumed its natural course, you could say. So if black does nothing here, you can see how these pieces are shut out from the queen side, and it's going to be very easy for white to advance the a pawn, break with b5, and break through on the queen side. So f5 played by Andreas, and actually this makes it a little bit complicated. Simplest is to take with the g pawn, but this was played. But this should be winning for white. At least the knight finds a square. But, you know, I mean, you know, after this, still, you know, white needs to find a way in. But anyway, the game went like this. It should be winning for white now, but this one is very clear. And the a pawn advances, so the knight has to keep hold of the f pawn to blockade the f pawn. This is very strong, and black's king is dragged over. I mean, it looks like black has achieved something, but actually it's not possible to approach the a pawn because of the bishop. And now that makes room for white's king. So a pawn advances and the king comes in. Okay, there was a little bit of toing and froing by white. I mean, I don't know exactly what happened here, but it just says 1-0. So I don't know whether Andreas resigned or whether there was time pressure or whatever. But it is winning. So basically, as I said, a7 will happen. Then king c5, and the king just marches in and forces a win. Okay, let's go back. I think overall we can say that black's play was just a bit too passive. And there were several moments where going forward would have been much better than retreating. Even at the end, there was a chance with knight d4. White is better here. I mean, possibly not playing bishop takes knight, but just playing the endgame. But black has chances there. So that was right at the end. Now let's go right back to the beginning. So h4. Now, I don't think much of h4 because given that black has this incredibly solid defensive setup, the fianchettoed bishop, as ever, very, very solid. I just don't see that this is much of a threat at all. So my first instinct is to ignore h4. Just don't react to it and just generate play on the other side of the board. So for example, one could play rook c8. Simple stuff. Just start an attack on this pawn. Okay, let's see. h5. I'm still not quite sure what this does. I mean, the computer says that actually it's possible even to take here. And then either playing bishop takes c4 or knight a5. And these are even some crazy stuff with knight c4. But yeah, why not? You know, white's king is still in the middle. You know, this is a very interesting position. And you can see, as ever in this line, these knights are lined up perfectly. So black already has how many pawns? 2 pawns. And, you know, something like this, piling the pressure on. I mean, whose king is safer here? Well, clearly black's. You know, that's very interesting. But after h5, one doesn't need to react to that. I mean, knight e7 is interesting. Typical in this line of other variations. So the pawn is hit. If b3, b5. Once again, these knights are lined up. This typical pin. So this is playable. What else we got? Given that this pawn could end up just being a weakness once white's king castles, then I would also consider b5. Again, absolutely typical of this line playing against the Marozzi. You have to try to break down white's centre. So you give a pawn. Okay, rook c8. And because the c pawn has gone, then black is ready to advance with d5. And you can see that, as ever in the Kalashnikov, I call this liberation station, when the pawn advances to d5, then black's pieces just flood into the position. And remember, black has more pawns in the centre. Black has greater control of the centre. And you have to ask, what on earth is this pawn doing on h4? At some moment, because the centre is exploding, the king will have to castle. And this pawn is, at best, irrelevant. And at worst, it's simply a weakness, and it weakens squares like g4. It's easier to put a piece there. So both b5 and rook c8 I would consider instinctively, I don't want to react to that h-pawn. It's kind of gives white something, you know, and that's why h6, well, you can see already black doesn't need to weaken the king like this, and white simply gains a tempo. It is also possible simply to blockade the pawn. Again, I wouldn't actually consider h5. I would go with one of the other moves. But h5 is also absolutely fine for black. I'm not fussed about the h-pawn. But the thing with h5 is that it now gives black the possibility to throw the knight into g4. So that could be very useful for black. And if f3 is played, well, it just looks really ugly. And white is wasting time. g4 is never going to be an issue. Just ignore it. And again, I think white's king is insecure. I mean, where's it going to go? So h5, I think, also looks absolutely fine. Now in the game, okay, so I'm being a bit critical of h6, I must admit, because white gains a tempo. As Andreas points out himself, h5 is still possible here, but white has gained a bit of time. Here I think white should probably push straight away. After rook d1, again, this is too passive. It's like black is believing white here. Black is kind of rolling, you know, acknowledging that there's a threat and go, oh, I've got to defend. Well, again, as soon as the knight goes back to e8, let's think, oh, too passive, way too passive. Okay, what could you play instead? Well, this move knight g4 is actually possible. I mean, it's a moot point, but maybe white should be playing h5 here and even castle queenside. Although, you know, that can be risky, but that might be even stronger than rook d1. Anyway, knight g4, I think is very interesting, because after this exchange, of course, black would very much like to take that dark square bishop. And then d4 comes under black's control. So after this exchange, yeah, gaining time against the rook, the bishop comes back, and notice the c-pawn is attacked. Well, also, there's no knight blocking the major pieces on the back rank. And after queen d6, well, it's possible just to do that. I mean, I can't believe black is worse in that position. But there's another move, knight d4. Very interesting. So, queen exchanges. But black certainly has compensation there. With, you know, that's a tricky position for white to negotiate, actually. And don't forget, this b-pawn could come into the game soon. So, you know, that's an interesting move, but don't like moving backwards. And, yeah, once g4 comes, then it's quite unpleasant because that bishop is so passive. Nevertheless, there were still chances after that. I mean, I would be looking at b5 here, just to try and stir things up while the king's in the centre, instead of falling into a passive position. Yeah, bit of material has to be invested. And I think this is better for white, but the position's messy. Because white's king doesn't have a home. Not a natural home anyway, you know. And in the game, yeah, now this is really unpleasant for black. Although, as I pointed out later, there were still chances. But by the time this happens, oof, this is pretty bad. This has gone badly wrong. So, just let me sum up. h4, well, basically one can just ignore that move. And I think in these kind of positions with a Maroczy bind, if you start playing passively, then it's not great. But there are tried and tested methods of hitting out against this centre on the c-file. and playing b5. Okay, well, I hope you found that instructive. As I said, I think those rules can apply to so many different openings, not just the Kalashnikov, but here very specifically, there are known ways to counter this kind of bind on the position. Right, hope you enjoyed that. Thanks for watching.